So I'm talking about Byzantine fault tolerance with dynamic participation. I think most of you here know what Byzantine fault tolerance is, but just in case, still let me define what it means for me. Right? So basically, there are lots of terms that mean roughly the same thing: BFT, blockchain, distributed ledger, state machine replication, atomic broadcast. Roughly mean the same thing. Right? What we want to do here is to have a set of participants agree on a totally ordered list of values, which is the ledger. And despite that, a fraction of the participants may be malicious, and we also call them Byzantine, who can deviate from the protocol arbitrarily and try to attack the system. And in this talk, we're going to focus on what's called layer 1, which is just to agree on this list of values. We don't quite care what these values are. And depending on the applications, these values could be monetary transactions, it could be smart contracts, or just generic storage. Right. And very quickly, the underlying technology of Bitcoin is a consensus algorithm, in that every participant, every miner, node in the system, or every user should agree on the common sequence of values, transactions. And if they do that, they're going to evaluate this series of transitions in the same way. They will always agree on the system state at every single point. This is called a state machine replication. This is a state machine, and everybody's evolving it in the same way. And the goal of the attacker is that the attacker tries to create disagreement. Right? For example, the attacker tries to create 2 transactions, right? And some of the replica servers are malicious. If the attacker can successfully make these nodes decide on conflicting transactions, and then you double spend the money. If we say it violates agreement, it breaks the consensus algorithm. And as you probably know, consensus is a decade-old problem, right? Dating back all the way to the 70s. And there's like 30 years of research before Bitcoin came about. Right? So one question that have been interested in for a long time is what's fundamentally new? Right? What's fundamentally novel about Bitcoin's algorithms? Right? There are actually quite a bunch of things, but it's not just about identifying what's new. Right? A new feature in Bitcoin may not be a good one. Right? Some features are good. Other features are new, but actually trade-offs or sacrifices that the Bitcoin designer had to make in order to get other good new features. Right? And also, the new features may not be super important. That it happened to have, but not part of the design goal, or later, no longer part of the design goal. Right. So this part is not exactly related to my talk, right, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. So yeah, we'll just take a brief pause and like to hear people's opinions. Like, what do you think is novel in Bitcoin, and what is good and what is important?
It's permissionless, and that's good.
It's permissionless. It's good. Yeah, I think that's the first thing everybody will observe, that Bitcoin is a permissionless network in the sense that I can start downloading the Bitcoin client. When I'm done, I will be part of the system. I can contribute to the system, right, with the infinite, the abysmal mining power I have. Right, no one can stop me from doing that.
That's dynamic participation also.
Dynamic participation, and it's in the title, so that's must be one.
What's the question? Is something like delegated proof of stake still considered permissionless?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I'm going to share my opinion on that.
It's also self-healing. It's a healing system. If you have a majority adversary temporarily.
Yeah, it's a great one. Yeah. All right. Yeah, let's start from this one. Permissionless. I think everybody agrees that's a new property in Bitcoin, and also I think there's very little argument that it seems to be a good property. Right? But I would argue that it may not be as important as touted. right? At least under my definition of permissionless, because I'm going to argue that proof of stake is not permissionless. Under the strict notion of permissionless, it means everybody can participate without permission from other people. In proof of stake, if I don't have the stake, I cannot participate. I have to go and purchase stake. And some existing stakeholder needs to be willing to sell me, right? And only then I get permission from that seller to participate in a system, right? So this is not as permissionless as Bitcoin, right? And if you think about it, the fact that I can purchase stake, it doesn't really make it any more permissionless than any classic protocol we have. Because in classic BFT, we write down a list of participants. We say the participants never change, and we call that permissioned. But there's nothing preventing a BFT participant from selling its membership, right? Saying my spot is up for sale. Right? Whoever pay me $100, you can take my spot. Right? That's there's no difference in that sense between proof of stake and classic BFT, from my perspective.
But to make an open market assumption that this money is not 5 coins that 5 rich guys have, but it's an open market like the euro or the USD,
Yep.
much more permissionless. Now, on the other hand, then Bitcoin also permissioned in the sense that I can likely not make my own CPU. I have to buy it from some producer that is making it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If we get into that level of detail, yeah, Bitcoin is. I think it's better than proof of stake information. But yeah, I hear that argument. Right. If it's an open market, I think we can also define proof of stake to also be permissionless, right? But if you go there, then I would argue that every single consensus protocol ever invented is permissionless. Okay. Or it's not a feature of the consensus layer. Right? It's more of a feature of ecosystem thing of the system.
Isn't in classic BFT, the number of participants is determined ahead of time? So sure, you can sell your spot to somebody else. But newcomers want to come in, you increase the number of participants.
Yeah, but I would say proof of stake, the participants is also fixed ahead of the time. Every cent, every smallest unit in the system is a participant, right? And it doesn't really change.
So that could be potentially large.
Right. Yeah. Then I think then you're getting to that. Yeah. Next. Property that I want to bring up. Right? I think I think proof of stake and classic BFT are, to me, as permissionless as each other, no more, no less permissionless than each other. However, proof of stake does have a major advantage over classic BFT protocols. That is, they allow dynamic participation.
Proof of work can be
both proof of work and proof of stake. And what we mean by that is that the total number of participants can change dramatically. Right? And so this is roughly the participation level of Bitcoin over time, right, measured by hash rate. And you can see over the 10 years, it increased a billionfold. Right? And there's also very dramatic drops, very dramatic sudden drops, about by half, occasionally. And
this doesn't mean participation increase. That just means hash rate increase.
Correct. Yeah, it's yeah. But I would say this sudden drop, that's roughly that should be participation level drop. Right? Yeah, the increase.
That's the China migration.
Yeah, the increase is more of everybody upgrading their hardware.
That's a CCP drop.
Right. So this is not the only one, right? And it's because this is the scale is too high, you can't really see what's going on. Right? If I zoom into just a random period, this type of sudden drops are actually quite frequent. Right? And well, this is not zero, so it's not as dramatic as it shows, but still, this is certainly a more than half drop. Right? And the bunch of ones that are at least a 30% drop ish.
But now you've zoomed in so much that these, because the hash rate is measured as an artifact of how many blocks are produced, these are just artifacts of the Boston process, right? So it's possible that
no, this is already averaged.
But it's not that long, right? It's 6th November to 20th of November, so the average cannot be that.
Well, cannot be that high, but even for 24-hour average, it's well, it would not be this dramatic. 24-hour would already be like hundreds of blocks, right? So that's laws of large number will kick in at that point.
44 blocks. But even if you look at just numbers, like How many block producers there are? You'll see a similar graph.
How many producers in which measure?
How many people created, like you can see who created different blocks?
You can always see that. You just
Yeah. You see. Oh, you're saying the same person might have multiple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what's going on, right? But these big jobs cannot be entirely explained away by other things like noise or random samples. Okay, so yeah, so that is a very unique property of a Bitcoin, that longest chain style proof of stake actually inherits, right? Whereas classic BFT protocols do not have that at all. Right. And I would argue this is novel, this is good, and it seems important for systems that deploy it in the real world. Okay, let me just give you one more quick example. Right. Another interesting property of Bitcoin is that its security increases over time. And when a block first shows up, you shouldn't trust it right away. Right? It's only when it's buried deep in the system, deep in the chain, then you should consider it finalized. Right? This is also a somewhat new property, right? But I would argue that it's not a good property. Right? It leads to long latency. If we could make a decision right when the block shows up, that is better. If we can do that, we should try to do that. Right. And that is the advantage of classic BFT. In classic BFT, the latency is relatively short, just within a few round trips of message delays, whereas longest chain style proof of work or proof of stake have pretty long latency. Okay, so yeah, so that leads to the main question of this talk, right, that I want to discuss. Right, can we achieve the best of both worlds? Right, can we design a protocol that support dynamic participation, fluctuating number of participants, and achieve low latency at the same time? Okay, a quick outline. I'll first quickly go over longest chain protocols and classic BFT, right, to give you a sense of why they exhibit the properties we mentioned earlier. Right, and then I'll define the model, and then I'll tell you how we extend classic BFT to have dynamic participation. Okay, right, so this is the longest chain consensus protocol. Most of you are probably very familiar with it. Right. The idea is that we have a bunch of participants, and there's a local lottery process that everybody tries their luck to create a block. Right, somebody get lucky, and it will append a new block to the longest chain. Right, and everybody does that, and the chain grows. Right, and we will decide on entries that are buried deep in the longest chain. Right, so that's what leads to long latency. Right, but this random process, this random election process, is what made the longest chain protocol tolerant of dynamic participation. Right? If suddenly many of the nodes leave and there are few nodes left in the system, right, the chain will still grow at a reduced rate. Right? But if you wait a bit, somebody will be lucky to solve the puzzle or get a lottery ticket, and you will contribute the block to the longest chain. Right? But the latency is not so great. Right, so roughly speaking, it's that formula. And let me break that down. The kappa is a security parameter, basically the confirmation depth. Right? The conventional wisdom is to wait for 6, but if you want a more cryptographic level security, you got to wait for a much longer time. Right? And the higher security you desire, the longer latency would be. And this is just simple illustration.
About the other parameter?
Yeah, I'm going there. Right. And so this one is actually addressed somewhat by the Prism that David's co-author on that paper, right, by having parallel chains. Right. So the latency of Prism no longer depends on that confirmation depth security parameter. Right. But there are other things in the latency formula. Right. For example, there is a notion of block interval. Right. How much time should we leave between two consecutive blocks? right? That interval needs to be reasonably larger than the message delay. Right? If the interval is too close to message delay, then blocks will be found around the same time, and it will not form a beautiful chain. It will be a very messy tree structure. Right? And that actually affects the fault tolerance. We say Bitcoin tolerates 50% adversary. That's not entirely true. It's more like 49-ish, 49.7%. Right? If you try to reduce the block interval, that will drop. Right? So Ethereum parameter in the ballpark, it would already drop to something like 44%, 45% fault tolerance. Right? So if you want high tolerance, close to 50%, that also hurts latency. Right. And lastly, we have another parameter called gamma that's I use it to denote the actual participation. Right. What I meant was that when we say Bitcoin should produce one block at every 10 minutes, right, that assumes a certain level of total hash rate. If suddenly half of the nodes, even more dramatic, even 80% of the nodes left, then you will not be able to sustain that 10-minute block interval. Right? The block will be every half an hour, 50 minutes, 1 hour, right? If suddenly nodes leave. Right? So that further contributes to the long latency. Right? So yes, there is a difficulty recalculation procedure, right? But that kicks in after you found thousands of blocks. Right? So if suddenly your blockchain grind to a halt and produce blocks very slowly, you wouldn't even be able to reach that difficulty recalculation. So that doesn't really help you. Okay, so this is the longest chain protocol and why it has bad latency and good dynamic participation. Right. In contrast, we have the classic BFT protocol. The most representative one is likely PBFT, but it's rooted in a long line of works starting from Lamport, Nancy Lynch, and others. The idea here in classic BFT is that we will designate a leader. First, it's a fixed number of participants. I will designate a leader. The leader makes a proposal. Then the participants vote in a few rounds, usually 2 rounds, sometimes 3 rounds or 1 round. Right? And if both rounds produce enough votes, then that's it. And we will make a decision right there. Right. So as you can see, this is very good latency, right? Just a constant number of message delays. Right? But this is not dynamic participation, because we require the number of votes we require is defined based on the total population, like total number of potential participants, right? Which I'll call big N here. Right? And if suddenly half of the nodes leave the system, then the protocol will stuck, and we will lose progress. Okay. So then, so roughly speaking, then this is what we will set out to do. We saw that longest chain protocol and classic BFT have these sort of trade-offs, and we'll try to do the best of both worlds. Have support dynamic participation and get the similar latency, constant latency as the BFT protocols. Okay, just let me very quickly review some related works, prior works. The aforementioned Prism and parallel chains remove that factor kappa security parameter from the latency, but some other terms stay. There's another work by Gaoyou et al. That also tries to improve latency under dynamic participation. They actually removed some other terms, but the kappa term stays. And there's another prior work that's achieved constant latency, but they're targeting unknown static participation, meaning that participation is not fixed beforehand, but once the protocol starts, it's fixed, it never changes. That's a much stronger model than what we're targeting here.
Can you define gamma? The number between 0 and 1?
Gamma is the number between 0 and 1. It's I would define it as the actual number of participants divided by the number of participants you expect to show up when you calculate some difficulty.
How do you measure the denominator in Bitcoin?
In Bitcoin is that the difficulty, how large the hash power is needed to in proof of stake. It would be how much fraction of stake needs to be online.
So over here, the dynamicity is it an arbitrary amount of change that is tolerated?
Yes, I'm going there. I'm going to the more formal model now. Okay. Yeah, so let's be more rigorous. So we have a system where there are n potential participants. Right? That n is fixed. You should think of it as say the total number of cents in a proof of stake system, and they know each other's public keys. So that's a PKI, but or you can also think of this initial state distribution, which is similar to a PKI. In this talk, I'm going to, in this work, we assume the set is fixed for simplicity, right? And it should extend to a changing set fairly easily, but we haven't written down all the details, so that I don't want to make a formal claim there. Okay. Okay, and at time t, we assume only a small n sub t number of participants are active. And among the active nodes, more than half of them are honest, and less than half of them are adversarial. Okay, these are pretty standard, reasonable assumptions. Right? And we assume any participant can transition between inactive and active at any time, right? Without any advance notice, and also in adversary's control. So adversary can decide to put anyone to sleep or wake up anybody according to its strategy.
And then if participation of regular participants declines, adversarial also have to do the market somehow, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a remark there that for now we're assuming the adversary participation, an adversarial participant does not go inactive, right? But this is just more of an artifact that we don't know how to model an adversary node going offline, right? Because it can, I'm an adversary node, I can give my secret key to Yoking, right? And then I drop offline, right? It's as if I never went offline, right? So if we have, right, but our protocol should be secure if I don't do that, if adversary node goes offline with its secret key, right? But yeah, we don't see how to model this rigorously, so we're putting that assumption for simplicity.
So how do you ensure then that it's the data line over to the adversarial? This NT can go to 0 in theory, right?
Right. So yeah. So then let's say there is an adversarial adversarial participation is non-decreasing. Right? It can only go up or stay the same, but the honest participation can be something like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but right, it would be good to have. Yeah.
I think going inactive, there's some other issues, right? That you can.
This is going in now.
Oh, this is just one inactive. Okay, all right. Oops, what happened there?
I am not something else.
You knocked something out of the
Apparently.
That's a good hit. Your hit is hostile.
Stop sharing.
Okay, why? Oh, we stopped sharing somehow.
Because it unplugged.
Okay, we're back. Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing fundamental that prevents the adversary also fluctuate like this. Right? We just don't know how to model that, how to put a well-defined restriction on the adversary that when you go offline, when you go inactive, you take your secret key with you. Right? That's to me, I think it's more of a technicality. Okay.
You can screen share your Zoom.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Oh, it is working.
Okay. Right. And right. So yeah, to answer Khalid's question quickly, the fluctuation can be super wild. Right? This second there are 1 million participants, next second only 10. Right? That's okay. We will preserve safety during this wild fluctuation, but we will temporarily lose liveness. Okay. Yeah. So this is the one sentence model for dynamic participation. And the problem we're trying to solve is this one that participants send values and agree on the ledger or on a sequence of values. Right? So it's standard to separate that problem into safety and liveness. Safety says no conflicting values. Liveness says we keep adding new values into the ledger. Okay, and just very minor note. The current way I define the problem is atomic broadcast, not state machine replication, because I didn't talk about the external clients. We can add external clients. There's some subtleties on how to define clients, how to define external clients in a dynamic system. Okay. And another very important piece of aspect of model is that we have to assume there is a known delay bound on the message transmission. It's a standard synchrony assumption between honest and active participants. And this has been shown to be necessary. Otherwise, dynamic participation is impossible due to formalized by Lewis and Rothgarden in the blockchain cap theorem paper. But it's it should be very straightforward to think about. If the message delay is unbounded, then you can have a partition. Right? Both partitions should make progress, right? Because it tolerates, because it's dynamic participation. Right? They should make progress no matter how small or how large that partition is. Right? So that's not solvable. Okay, one last remark. When inactive participant does not take any action. Right? So what we try to capture with inactive participant is one that willingly leaves the system. That I shut down my mining operation, I shut down my validating operation. Right? We're not trying to model a node that has some network outage that doesn't receive messages but unaware of the network failure. Right? That's again seems impossible, right? Because then if I'm isolated, I cannot talk to anybody, but I don't know, I should make progress according to the dynamic participation rule.
On that model, but is it okay if I suddenly unplug my computer? Like, do I have to notify others that I'm
No, we don't have no advance notice when you join or leave. When you join, you do need to contact people to pick up this current state.
And we allow the adversary to pick who goes.
Yes. Yes.
Can be adaptive.
Yes. Yeah, we will maintain safety there, but if it's too wild, then we don't have liveness. The liveness requires a stable period of participation. Okay, yeah, so that's the model. And next, I want to tell you how we do it. Right. So at a high level, we're going to extend classic BFD to support dynamic participation. Okay, so the part that needs to be extended is this notion of quorums. And quorum is basically a fraction of votes, or a fraction of messages. Right, then let's say in our system we're trying to tolerate dishonest minority. Right, so the threshold of a quorum is 1/2 in the classic protocols. Right, basically it means I will take the next step if the previous step, if I receive half n confirmations in the previous step, right, roughly speaking. Right, but that requires everybody knowing the value of big N. And that pretty much everybody needs to be participating. Right? But once we're in the dynamic participation, we need a notion of dynamic quorum. Right? The threshold for the quorum, how large of a quorum do I consider large enough? That needs to be defined based on the actual participation, right? Not the predefined participation. Right? But nobody knows the actual participation, so the best we can do is to define it using the perceived participation. Right? Meaning that everybody will announce that I am here, I am participating, right? Then I will count how many people are participating, then set half of that as my quorum threshold. Okay. Yeah, everybody active, it will send I am awake. And if there are 3 I am awake, then the quorum size is more than half of that, which is 2. Okay, now the main challenge we need to overcome is that the perceived participation may be different at different nodes. Because the bad guys can selectively announce themselves, right? We can try to forward the bad guys' announcement, but there will always be a delay in how much participation I perceive versus David perceive versus them perceive, etc. Right? And that is a major problem because now our quorum certificates, a set of messages that form a quorum, is no longer transferable. Right? Meaning that if I have, say, I received 5 votes, I'm the green guy, right? Then I would say 5 votes is a quorum, right? Because it just narrowly exceeds my perceived half of the participation. Right? However, this orange guy perceived 1 more participation than I do, right? And when I show the set of votes I got to the orange person says that's not enough, right? That doesn't meet the quorum. So he breaks this notion of transferability of classic quorums, right? And that is very important in the classic protocols. We crucially rely on that. Right? Because in classic BFT, basically we repeatedly use this subroutine where, roughly speaking, if one node makes a move in the classic protocol, then every other honest node needs to make a weaker move, needs to weakly support that move. It's kind of like if we hire a new faculty, then strongly champions the faculty. In order for that to go through, everybody else in the department cannot oppose. They may not be as excited as them, but they needs to be at least weakly supportive or accepting papers and similar. Okay, so if you're familiar with how classic BFT protocols work, and here are some examples that where classic protocols use this type of subroutines. If one node decides, then everybody lock, or soft decide on that value. If one node's lock on the value, then everybody has seen that value. Or if one person cast my round 2 vote, if I cast my round 2 vote, I want all of you to at least receive enough round 1 votes, something like that. Right. We can also formalize that a little bit using a notion of graded agreement. If I output a value with a higher grade, then everybody else should output that value with a lower grade. And this is very easy to achieve in classic BFT. Right? That's also why when you look at the classic BFT protocol, you probably didn't even notice that they're doing this. Right? The reason is that I just make my strong move by requiring a quorum of votes. Right? Then I'll forward the quorum of votes to everybody. Right? You will recognize that, yes, indeed, that is a quorum of votes. Right? So my action is justified. Right? You are receiving these votes from me, so you don't receive it at the same time as I do. Therefore, you don't make the strong move. You don't take the strong action, but you will be convinced, right, that when I say I make the move, I'm not lying. Right? So you should weakly support my action. Okay. So yeah, so basically now we just need to restore this notion of certificate transferability to dynamic quorums. If we can do that, then we can just follow classic BFT paradigm and build dynamic participation DFT. So, and the key idea here is a notion called time-shifted quorum. Right. For now, I will assume that we are going to do lockstep rounds. That at the end of the round, everybody sends a message. At the beginning of the round, everybody sends a message. At the end of that round, everybody receives the message. Right. So fully synchronized. Right. We don't need this assumption. Right. We can get rid of it, but this keeps things simpler. Okay, and also we'll assume everybody forward every newly received message. All right, so first step, everybody will send awake one message announcing that I am awake. Also, everybody will send a pre-vote message for a certain value. Okay. The second round, they will forward those messages. They will forward all the messages they received in round one, and also they will count how many pre-votes they got. I'll record that count as V1, right? And that is a V1 per node. Everybody has a different V1. Okay, next round, a bunch of things happening. So I will again count how many pre-votes I got. So I'll record V2. V2 will be higher than V1 because I'm kind of continuously counting how many votes I got. Right. And I'll also recount how many awake one messages I got. We'll call that M2. Right. Then I'm sending awake 2. I'm announcing again that I am still here. That's a separate, that's an additional message. Right. If V2 is greater than half of M2, then I will vote, and I will give you, will tell you why we do that later. Okay. Now, very last step, I once again count how many awake one on top of what we received. Right. If V1 is larger than half of M3, then I will make my move. And if votes is larger than awake 2 by half, then weekly support. Yeah, so bear with me, I just dumped the entire protocol, but the intuition should be reasonably straightforward. Okay, so now let's bring in another node.
So can I ask, why is V2 increasing over V1? I mean, aren't all pre-votes by your assumption and they're all going to be received by the second group?
No, because this is V1 is pre-votes I received by now.
But weren't you assuming that the distance between these two bullets is delta? So by the
Yeah,
time,
it's a one round, one full delta. Yeah.
so wouldn't they all be received? Or are you saying somebody else could continue to send?
Right, everybody's supposed to send over there, but somebody can
Send it later.
maliciously can send it later, or even later on.
Actually.
Okay, let's now bring in another node, because what I want to prove is that if I don't know which one I'm going to use. If this particular node makes the strong move, then everybody else is going to make the weak move. Let's see why that's the case. First, I'm going to argue that the V1 of this guy is smaller than V2 of that guy. That is because everybody is forwarding everything, right? So if the bottom node sees V1 votes here, the bottom node personally will guarantee that everybody will see in the next round what I saw in the previous round. Right? So everybody's V2 is larger than that node's V1. Right? The same reason, everybody's M2 will be smaller than this guy's M3. Right? Same reason, because if they saw certain M2, they will send it my way. Okay, yeah, so that's basically it. Right? Therefore, if I'm making that move, my V1 is larger than half of V3. Okay. And my V1 is smaller than their V2. And my M3 is larger than their M2. Right? So if this is true, then that inequality is true for everybody. right? So therefore, if I make the strong move, everybody is going to vote. If everybody is going to vote, then everybody is going to receive enough votes, more than the number of awake 2 in the entire system. So they will all weakly support my move.
The assumption here that we cannot disappear throughout the process. So honest notes that voted awake 1, do they still have till the end?
No, they can, anybody can leave at any point. Yeah.
Can you explain again the final verdict that are bigger than the wake 2?
This one?
So why is that?
Because if anybody makes a strong move, everybody executed this line, right? So everybody is sending vote. Right. So if the attacker doesn't attack, then the number of votes and number of awake 2 should be exactly the same. Right? The bad guys may be sending awake 2, but do not send vote. Right? But the bad guys are minority.
What does that mean? Votes greater than?
If number of votes is greater than number of awake 2, I received by this point.
That means there's weak support for the move of this.
Yes, yes.
So you can only make a move if you are awake at the second point, second move on.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it would probably require something even slightly stronger than that. You can only make a move if you stayed awake during this whole time. So that's why during wild fluctuation of participation, we cannot be live. But safety doesn't require on that assumption.
So weak support does not have to be expressed later, right? So weak support means that basically we know that you supported it, you don't have to do it.
Yeah, it's a more of a local computation. Okay. Right. And yeah, that's all I plan to tell you, because once you understand this part, the rest is pretty standard BFT, that there's very little novelty there. And
That means this primitive is repeated.
yes, this primitive is repeated for every original BFT step needs to be replaced by this whole thing.
Is the true number of rounds goes up by a factor of 4, or is there a way to shrink the number of rounds?
Yeah, we didn't try that hard to shrink things. Yeah, we blow up the number of rounds quite a bit. And so, roughly speaking, we'll use the time-shifted quorum to build a graded agreement, which is a trivial step in classic BFT that people don't even notice. Right? And with that, and we'll use some sort of procedure to build a random leader election, and then put them together. Then we can build regular BFT protocols. Right? And concretely, our graded agreement is 7 delta time, and we need 5 of those. Turns out it's a relatively large constant. Right. So yeah, so it may not be super practical yet, right? But this is yeah, very excited about the results. It's the first time we can achieve constant constant message delay latency in dynamic BFT.
Going back to your checklist about what's new about Bitcoin. Right?
Okay, yeah, I plan to say a few more things.
Oh, you haven't finished it. Okay.
I plan to say a few more things on that, but I'm pausing here for, yeah, if people have questions on this part. This is the full protocol. I don't know if it's interesting to walk through it.
So since the honest nodes can go offline and come offline later, if they come offline later, is there any security guarantee for what happened in the past for them?
Yeah, if you newly joined, you need to get the correct state. You need to contact many people and hope that you at least contacted one good node, and that node transferred the correct transcript.
The whole transcript of messages.
Not the whole thing. So the things are the committed blocks will be justified. The committed blocks will have certificates, and in this system, the certificates is transferable. So yeah, so the transcript you get will be verifiable.
We need to see the correct number of awake messages, for example. Even the newly joining node has to see the same number of like awake messages that the nodes at that point saw.
Yeah, that's a good point, but we're not doing it that way. So in normal BFT, there is enough beside message make a block final. Like we will these nodes still will produce beside messages. I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so some future directions. Yeah, can we get better concrete latency lower than 37? Can we get better communication? Right now, every message is forwarded by everybody. Right? It's also not great. Right? Yeah, and what else is novel, good, and important in Bitcoin? I think it's a wealth of new problems. And for every single one we identify, we can ask, can we formalize them? Can we formally prove that Bitcoin has this property? And we see the ad hoc. And can we achieve these new properties, new good properties, without incurring the drawbacks of longest chain protocols? Right, so here's some of the things I see. Bitcoin, the longest chain protocol, likely tolerates some message loss, right? Likely tolerates some timing model in between synchrony and hypersynchrony that we haven't figured out how to define. And yeah, Bitcoin uses sparse network. Right? Is that ad hoc trick, or is that just formally rigorously justifiable? Right? Yeah, I think someone said a very nice one that it also tolerates temporary majority corruption. I should have put it here. Right, yeah, thanks a lot. That's all I have.